Today, we become legends.
Smite 2 so far has had a troubled development to say the least. I've argued in many videos that the game was revealed too soon and should have been delayed a year to be released in a more complete state, but there is definitely an argument that without such wide-scale feedback, the game could have derailed from community expectations even further than it already has. To that end, the game clearly needs change, and while we have gotten plenty of that, especially with the closed alpha 1 patch, there's still a lot to be done. I sent out a survey to both my YouTube audience and the Smite Reddit to gather data on 26 different aspects of Smite 2 and asked you guys to rate them all on a scale of importance to focus on from 1 to 10. 1 being no focus at all and 10 being a massive focus on this particular feature. I then averaged out the scores from the over 500 respondents and we'll discuss the findings in this video. If you enjoyed these types of videos from me, then don't forget to drop a like and subscribe for more, but without further ado, let's jump in. So before we get to the topics themselves, I added one final question to the bottom of the survey about how people generally feel about Smite 2 at the moment. Here's those results. Far and away the most popular answer at 64.6% of the respondents was that the game is just okay right now but has good potential in the future. The next two most popular were far less so, with the game is great right now and has good potential at 18.6% and the game is bad right now but has good potential at 12.1%. Which leaves the other three responses that think the game won't last at just 4.8% of respondents. Of course, people taking time out of their day to do a survey about how to improve the game will naturally care more about it and think it will last. So these results are definitely somewhat biased. Moving on though, let's jump into the actual 26 topics we had on the survey in ranked order. So coming in dead last at a score of 2.19 out of 10, we have slowing down the development of Smite 2 to focus more on Smite 1. With the launch of Smite 2 24/7, we saw it get way more players than Smite 1, but over time that has shifted dramatically to where Smite 2 now only gets about a third of the players Smite 1 gets on average. In this regard, I half expected this response to be more popular, but it seems most people who have gone back to Smite 1 aren't doing it because they will never accept Smite 2 and only want to play Smite 1. They're probably doing it because Smite 2 just lacks content at the moment and we're waiting on updates to make the game more substantial. Unless there's new things to try, why play the more bare bones unfinished experience when the real deal is sat right there in your Steam or console library? Next up at number 25 in the rankings we have skins and cosmetics, which is a solid bump up at 3.60 out of 10 but still very low on the priority list according to you guys. And this is completely understandable. At this stage of Smite 2's development, there's way more important things to focus on than filling the game with skins, events, battle passes and cosmetics. This stuff is important, not just for high-res bottom line, but because people genuinely like having skins and collectibles. We saw this firsthand with the storm that was kicked up over people losing them going into Smite 2, but this is the sort of thing that should only be looked at after free-to-play launch in my opinion, and even then it should start small and ramp up while other more core areas of the game should be focused on. Next up at number 24 is radical conquest changes, which I defined in the survey as changes to conquest that are radical and outside of MOBA norms, for example 4 lanes, no jungle, 6v6, etc. And I can totally understand why this scored very low. The MOBA formula works for a reason, and while major departures from it could be wildly successful, see Deadlock for an example of that, it's also wildly risky to go that route, especially for a sequel and not a brand new IP. People come to Smite for that core MOBA formula but in third person with a mythology theme. Radically changing that will be changing the core identity of the game, and it could drive people away, so it's understandable why this question scored very low. Moving on though, at number 23 and scoring 4.55, we have free-to-play open beta ASAP, which I have to say I was surprised scored this low. I did expect it to be quite unpopular, don't get me wrong, but I have also heard a lot of anecdotal evidence that players are waiting for the game to go free-to-play before trying it. That said, as mentioned before, the respondents of this poll are likely more dedicated Smite fans that have either already tried Smite 2 or have watched enough content to know a lot about it. A lot of players waiting for free-to-play are likely more casual and less likely to take the time to respond to this poll or even be aware of it in the first place. That said, I do pretty much agree with this placement, as we want the game to be in a solid state with plenty of content, minimal bugs and a good core gameplay experience before it's released free to play, as that will be the true test of whether the game has staying power or not and when it will acquire a lot of its new players. Someone who's never played Smite 1 is very unlikely to want to pay $30 to play an alpha version of Smite 2, but they're much more likely to try it out once it goes free to play, so you want that first impression to be a good one. Hence why rushing to free to play ASAP is probably a bad idea in the game's current state. Next up at number 22 we have more game modes, which scored at 4.66 and I do generally agree with. Once again, this one is likely affected by the more dedicated or hardcore bias of a poll like this. The more casual a player you are, the less likely you are to respond to a poll like this or even to know it exists, and the more likely you are to enjoy these additional game modes instead of conquest. That said, I do personally think keeping the game mode offering small this early in development is a good thing. Splitting the player base is bad, and splitting the development time and effort is also bad when so much more needs to be done with the core game and adding other content that affects everyone's experience, like gods, rather than adding new game modes that only 10% of the player base actually care for. We already know Assault and Joust/Duel are coming, but I think they should definitely stop there. Personally, I wouldn't have even brought anything but Conquest and Assault this early in development to focus on other things, as there's always opportunity cost of dead time spent on game modes that could be focused on more important aspects of the game. But since we already know Assault and Joust are coming and Conquest and Arena are there already, they should absolutely leave it there in terms of core game modes in my opinion for now. Moving on though, next up at number 21 with a score of 4.79, we have making Smite 2 more like Smite 1, which is another that was a little surprising to me, but once again could be affected by the more dedicated player bias of a poll like this. The more dedicated you are, the more time you spent grinding the hell out of Smite 1 and want something different, and the more likely you are to respond to this poll. This does seem to be the direction high-res are going in at the moment, with stuff like Pyro and Totem returning, bringing back a bunch of core Smite 1 items, etc. And I'm a little mixed on this one. I think making the core game feel like Smite 1 is very important, because Smite 1 for the most part feels really good and works. But I can also totally understand the perspective that people want a new experience, not just Smite 1.5, and bringing back everything Smite 1 had is just going to make the game feel too similar to it. Next up at number 20, we have a better home screen, which scored 5.09, and there's not too much to say on this one. It is something I immediately notice when I log in that makes the game feel unfinished. But there are more important things to focus on than this, and a lot of things that would normally be featured on the home screen in Smite 1 haven't even yet been added to Smite 2, so a more barren home screen somewhat makes sense. Moving on though, at number 19, scoring 5.29, we have a larger focus on the competitive side of the game and SPL. So this is one where I sort of disagree, but I think I see where this comes from. Smite 2 in its current state has bigger problems than a weak pro scene, so I can understand why at this very moment a pro scene is considered low priority. But I think in the long run, prioritizing this is important, not just for those that enjoy watching pro play, but also because this kind of stuff trickles down to regular players as well. If the game is being balanced and designed with a competitive atmosphere in mind, it will make the game better and more balanced for regular players as well. Of course, Smite has more casual players than your typical MOBA, and especially mains of game modes other than Conquest will have less impact from this kind of thing, but I do feel like a good, healthy, competitive scene for the game has knock-on effects for the entire game itself and is important. But yeah, at this very moment, I don't think it's as important as other things that could be focused on. Next up at number 18, we have faster new God releases at 5.74, which surprised me a little. God releases have always been super hype and a well-loved aspect of Smite that has been sorely missed in year 11, and overall, I think our first two releases for Smite 2 have been good additions. Hecate took a while to get there, but is a good design in my opinion, and Mordred, bugs and balance aside, is one of the best releases they've made in years. There was also a question right next to this one on the survey that was about faster ported God releases, so maybe people just scored this one low because they scored that one high and would prefer their favorite gods to be ported over compared to getting new releases. Well, for me, I think new releases are important as long as they're done right, since they can showcase the new systems and mechanics of Smite 2 and what they can do with UE5. This can be shown a bit with returning God releases like changes to Hades and etc, but there's also only so much they can do when they want to preserve the core kit of the god. But yeah, overall, I am a little surprised this one scored so low. At number 17 with a score of 5.78, we have making the game less like Smite 1, which I won't discuss in detail to avoid repeating what I said about them making the game more like Smite 1 question, but this did score more than a full point above that one, so there is a noticeable sentiment that making the game more unique and less like Smite 1 is preferred over making it more familiar. Next up, an earned currency system akin to Favor, which scored 5.80. I think just slightly below average is a good place for this one. It is important, especially for when the game goes free to play and people without a Founders Edition need to buy gods, but it's not something that needs immediate focus at this stage of a closed alpha. But yeah, as we approach free to play launch, I think a system like this does need to be there. At number 15, and the first entry to score above the average of 6.17, we have keeping the game in alpha for longer, which scored 6.25. Again, I won't spend too much time on this one as it is just the inverse of a previous question, free to play open beta ASAP, and I've talked about it there, but there is a massive gap between that and this, showing that people want the game to go free to play in a good state and are okay with a longer alpha phase to make that happen. Next up at number 14, we have graphics and visual improvements at a score of 6.32, which I think is in a good spot around the average. This stuff is important as the first thing you see about the game before you get into any of the god kits, deep mechanics or systems, so making a good first impression, especially as we approach free to play, is important. But many games with bad or low quality graphics have been successful because their core gameplay and systems are top notch, so I do think focusing on that stuff over graphics is smart. Next up at 6.56 is to drop all focus on Smite 1 to accelerate Smite 2's development. This This is the inverse of a previous question, slow down Smite 2 to keep Smite 1 going, so again, I won't spend much time here, but there is a massive gap between those two, with the latter scoring at the absolute bottom of the list by far and more than 4 whole points behind this one. So there is a clear appetite for focusing less on Smite 1 and getting Smite 2 ready faster. That said, again, there is probably a more hardcore player bias here that will benefit this side of the debate. Next up at number 12, we have a UI editor / general UI overhaul, which scored 6.68, and I'm surprised that made it this high, to be honest. For me personally, I do love having a UI editor that I can customize and make people horrified at my choices with. But the fact that the UI editor scored higher than new God releases and some others on this list is somewhat crazy to me. It's an important aspect of the game for sure, but I would rather more content and fixes to the core game come first over a UI editor personally. Marketing the game comes in at number 11 with a score of 6.80, which I'm going to assume means marketing it as we approach free-to-play launch, because marketing the game right now is pretty pointless. Every successful MOBA in existence is free-to-play, and if you advertise Smite 2 to a general audience, they click on the store page and see they have to pay a minimum of $30 to access it, it's gonna leave a bad taste in their mouth. It's literally 10 times better to make the general public not even aware of Smite 2's existence right now, as the most likely scenario is that they look up the game, see all the negative press and videos about it, see they have to pay for a MOBA and never touch it again. But yeah, as I said, people probably answered this assuming it meant marketing the game as it approaches free to play. Not right this second, or it would have scored lower. Let me know in the comments if this is true. Breaking the top 10, we have game balance and meta at 6.87, which again I assume was answered with a more long-term goal in mind, since balance at this very moment is definitely not that important. Of course, you want the game to be balanced enough to be playable. You don't want a god that literally one-shots with a single auto attack or basic attack, but fine-tuning balance and the meta right now isn't that important. At the risk of sounding like a broken record though, as we approach free-to-play open beta and especially full release, this becomes a lot more important. Coming in at number 9, we have proper tutorials and new player onboarding, which scored 6.90, which again I assume is scored based on approaching free-to-play and not at this very moment. Right now, the vast majority of people playing Smite 2 are familiar with Smite 1 and don't really need a basic tutorial. But as the game approaches free-to-play launch and the marketing ramps up, these kind of systems need to be there. Smite has always had an issue with keeping new players, and a large part of that is that the base tutorials in Smite 1 are absolutely terrible and do not prepare new players for a real match of Smite at all. Some will look up external resources, get a foothold and start to enjoy the game, but many of them won't and will just get stomped into the ground with no idea of anything except how to play Neath basically and will quit. Having good tutorial systems that actually teach players the fundamentals of each conquest role, the fundamentals of items and building, what objectives are and why they're important, etc. will be crucial for keeping new players interested in the game. Next up at number 8, we have a larger focus on casual play at 6.94, which is an inverse of the larger focus on competitive play question from earlier, so again, I won't talk about this much, but there is a clear gap between the two in favor of more casual play focus. Coming in at number 7, and the first to score over a 7, we have Major God Reworks at a score of 7.09. This one I completely agree with. It's not the absolute highest priority thing, especially not right now. We'd rather focus on getting the less problematic gods with smaller changes in so we can size up the roster quickly. But as we do start getting these more problematic gods ported, this is incredibly important. Gods like Arachne, Freya, Bakasura, Vamana, Nox, Bakekujira, the list goes on. Smite 2 is the perfect and possibly only chance to properly rework these gods into something more healthy and fun for the entire player base, rather than just the 1% of people that actually enjoy these gods while the other 99% has to suffer playing against them. At number 6, we have new and interesting items that leverage Smite 2's new systems and mechanics, which scored a 7.26, and I once again agree with this placement. There's fleeting glimpses of the great potential with the new item system in Smite 2 already, like a lot of the support active items. But right now, not enough is being done, and hopefully the team gets more familiar with Smite 2 and the direction they want to take it, and make some more crazy and actually fun items. Because as it is right now, a solid 50% of the items in the game are just boring and uninspired, and yes, that includes some of the Smite 1 items that were ported over. Items are a core feature of the game that affects everyone, from arena to conquest, from casual to competitive, from easy gods to hard gods. These kind of systems that affect literally every facet of the game are incredibly important to get right, and should be prioritized way more than individual things like specific game modes or specific god changes. Breaking the top 5 though, we have post-match stats, T-screen, and other things like it with a score of 7.59. This one is somewhat surprising in how high it placed. Don't get me wrong, I love these systems for flexing, checking how I did in a game, roasting my friends for their 10k damage Zeus in a 30-minute game, but I do think there are some more important things below this on the list, like new and interesting items, an earned currency system, etc. But this is clearly something that community really wants and thinks should be prioritized soon. I just don't think it's a top 5 issue in my personal opinion. At number 4, we have matchmaking and ranked improvements, which scored a 7.82, and I completely agree. Good matchmaking is the backbone of a good core experience with the game, and we're seeing that firsthand with Smite 2 right now. Matchmaking currently feels like it sometimes just completely turns off and puts you with entirely random players, and it makes for an awful experience for everyone involved. Experienced players don't want noobs on their team, and noobs don't want to be put against experienced players that will completely destroy them. If the core gameplay experience of the game is bad, nothing else matters, and good matchmaking is key to the core gameplay experience. Definitely important to get running as soon as possible, and absolutely crucial to have in before free-to-play launch, because the matchmaking in Smite 2 right now is completely unacceptable. Breaking the top 3 and the first to score above an 8, we have faster returning God releases, which is probably the most expected placement of all time. The God designs of Smite are a huge reason why people even play the game at all, and everyone has their core group of favorite gods, some even going as far as saying they won't play Smite 2 at all until at least one of them is there. Having a varied god pool also makes the general gameplay better, as matches are more varied and you're not just playing against the same 3 gods in your role every single match. This should absolutely be one of the highest priorities for Smite 2 right now. At number 2, with a score of 8.71, we have fixing major bugs within the game, which scored higher than I expected, but I think the wording of major bugs that impact the game in a big way probably aided in that. Small, minor bugs that don't truly impact the game aren't as important, but Smite 2 is unacceptably buggy at the moment, even for an alpha. I personally, and probably many others as well, thought that a fresh codebase and working in a newer engine would result in less bugs, but Smite 2 is significantly more buggy than Smite 1 at the moment, and that definitely needs to be addressed, especially before free-to-play launch. Every possible effort should be made into making the launch patch of open beta as bug-free as possible. Us seasoned Smite veterans know what we're in for and can look past even a major bug ruining our match from time to time, but a completely new player coming in with no prior experience and having their first match or two ruined by a game-breaking bug, they will just close the game and never open it again. It's very important to get the bug problem under control, especially for free-to-play launch. And finally, the most important thing for Smite 2, according to the community with a whopping score of 9.16 out of 10, is focusing on the core game feel of Smite 2. This one is a little nebulous, which is perhaps why it scored so high, as people can interpret this however they want. But what I generally mean by this is how crisp the game feels, how responsive it is, removing sluggishness, desync, and poor animations that don't match abilities, that kind of stuff. This has been worked on quite substantially over the course of the alpha phase, and the most recent build of Smite 2 compared to the first time we ever played it is a massive improvement. But there is definitely still work to be done on making the core game feel better to play, so I completely understand why this placed at the top of the list, even if it is a bit nebulous in what it actually means. But that's it, the most and least important issues to focus on for Smite 2 according to you guys. What's your personal most important issue? Let us all know down below, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.